Welcome back to the Happy Saver podcast. I'm Ruth, a personal finance blogger right here in Aotearoa. Now, have you ever wondered about other people and their money? Well, in this podcast, I chat with a pretty diverse bunch of just regular people, the majority of whom are Kiwis, but the odd Australian does sneak in, and I learn their stories about their financial experiences, and then I share helpful, relatable information from Kiwis who are generously explaining how they handle their pūtea or money here in New Zealand. In today's episode, I'm going to be sharing the financial journey of Jack, a Kiwi from the lower North Island. Now, we picked up the phone in September of 2024 for a good old kōrero. Now, Jack's not his real name. Like many of the people I chat with, they are literally just everyday people who never seek the spotlight, but they want to share their money story nonetheless. And me protecting their identity by changing their name is a way for them to do that. Jack found the Happy Saver when he was searching for podcasts on money. As an investor in rental property, he was looking to learn about shares. And as you'll find out shortly, he leads an interesting life. And because he was down in Central Otago riding the very famous rail trail and doing other interesting things, well, earlier in the year, he actually looked me up and he called in for a visit. He has a personality that I can relate to. He said he could talk to a lamppost, and as a result, he meets heaps of people, so he had no qualms about stopping in to visit Jonny and I. We've stayed in touch since, and I'm pleased I have because Jack gets about a bit. When we chatted for this podcast, he was actually sitting in San Fransisco, having just had many months overseas, and was getting ready to board a 3-week cruise to bring him back home to Aotearoa. But before I go too much further, I want to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor. Okay, you've got me, I'll admit it, I'm the money nerd in our household. I genuinely enjoy keeping a very close eye on Pocketsmith as it tracks our retirement funds, our investments, the value of our home, and of course the daily flow of money into our mini bank accounts. The details fascinate me, numbers fascinate me. But my husband Jonny, not so much. He just wants to know we're doing okay, but he is just not interested in all those details. We both think of money differently. Pocketsmith is aware of this as it lets me create a custom dashboard that shows Jonny the same information I see, but differently, in far less detail, meaning he still gets to play an active role in our joint financial planning using information that makes sense to him. If you have a spouse trying to opt out of talking about your money, I think Pocketsmith might be the secret weapon to bring you together and foster healthy conversations around money in your home. If you want to supercharge your finances with Pocketsmith, have we got a deal for you. Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of Pocketsmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/the Happy Saver. That's pocketsmith.com/the Happy Saver. Jack is currently 51, the youngest of 3, and was born in Wellington and grew up and still lives on the lower western side of the North Island. He told me a little of what life was like growing up. His parents worked in horticulture, his mum mostly from home, and his dad as a fitter and turner. He said he was fed and loved well, and they always paid Jack to do jobs on the farm, and they encouraged him to work and save his money. If he wanted a new bike, and if he and his siblings wanted to buy junk, well, they had to save up and pay for it in full. He remembers working for a neighbour down the road collecting eggs and earning $10 a week, plus extra jobs for his parents. He recalled that he managed to save up $500 by about the age of 12, which was not a bad effort back in 1985. He was encouraged to put his money into a term deposit, and he clearly remembers that the interest rate at the time was 21%, so after just a year, he earned about $100 in interest to add to his original $500 savings. He recalls that this felt pretty good at the time, so going forward, each time he saved up $100, he would invest it in a term deposit. Jack always had after-school jobs, and he was allowed to spend his money pretty much how he liked. He said his parents didn't really pay much attention to how much he spent, but although he spent a bit, he was also very good at adding it to the savings that he already had. On the other hand, his brother used to work for money, spend it all, and then come to Jack for a loan. Jack said he was the lender of last resort for his big brother, lending him $20 but making him pay back $30. They always paid him back and were soon broke again, but he assures me that they came good in the end. When I asked if there were any standout money moments that shaped how he is with money today, he said that the guy he used to collect eggs for each week gave him the advice to spend a little and save a little, something that he took to heart at a young age. When he was a teenager, his nana gave him a book on money. Unfortunately, he can't remember the title, but the book, which he read many times, made a really strong impression on him. There was a chapter showing two financial scenarios. One was financing a house, the other was financing a car. It showed the math on what each would be worth 10 years later, and it broke it all down, showing how an asset, which is the house, grows in value and a liability, which is the car, goes down in value. The lesson it taught him was that you want to buy assets, not liabilities, and he feels it set him on the right track by showing him that math. He finished school at the end of sixth form, or year 12, mainly because he was pretty bored by it. He said he had the brains, but he lacked the ability to concentrate. He was 17 years old and he went and worked in horticulture for 6 months until he became aware of the dairy industry. He said that back then, in the 1990s, working was not like it is now. He refers to this time in the dairy industry as 10 years of slavery, where he worked long days for low pay. In his first job, his accommodation was supplied, but he earned just $830 a month, and he got just 2 days off per month. And he got paid the same whether the month had 28 days or 31. That's just $10,000 a year, more or less. In 1990, there was no law requiring employees younger than 20 to be paid a minimum amount, and thankfully, times have changed. He worked so hard that he had no time for the sports he once enjoyed or for heading out hunting, and he felt that wherever he put his attention, something else was missing out. The money he'd saved up in the bank was used to buy his first car, a 1972 Toyota Corolla, and when I asked if he still had it today, he said that after owning it for many years, he ended its life in a demolition derby, which I guess in a way was exactly what that book predicted, that the value of a car would go to zero. After a couple of years, he became a farm manager, and while the pay did improve, he still worked every hour there was and only got 2 days off every 2 weeks. He actually got married at the age of 20. They combined their finances, but he was divorced at 25. And hindsight showed him that they were just too young, and he said he didn't communicate enough and tended to be pretty impulsive. Plus, both of them, not just him, they worked too hard, he on the farm and she in a hardware store, and they just never really saw each other, which is not the ideal way to have a marriage. Given he worked about 80 hours a week and she worked full-time too, they saved money, meaning that in 1993, when he was just 20, he and his wife bought their first house. They put down a $7,000 deposit on a $70,000 property in a small lower North Island town with a population of about 15,000. The mortgage interest rate was 13%. Given they lived on the farm in a free house, he bought this house specifically as a rental property. So from the age of 20, his primary long-term plan has been to make money through capital gains on property. And when I asked him why he chose to buy property to rent, he said that at the time, property was considered the only option. The 1987 share market crash was still very much being talked about, and everyone was terrified of the share market. Property was seen as a safe investment. The rental income he received was enough to pay most of the bills, and they only had to put in a nominal amount to cover the shortfall. And then he and his wife, they just cracked on paying the mortgage off. They were frugal and focused. He knew he wanted to get out of farming, and investing in property would, he hoped, let him do that. They put all their money into extra mortgage payments, and every year for 4 years they bought another house in the same town. By 1998, they owned 4. And in case you were wondering, they didn't have to build up a deposit again. The bank let them use the equity they'd created in their properties to act as a deposit on the next one. Over the 4-year period they were buying, the values of the houses in the area never moved, and they essentially paid the same price, about $70,000 for each property. In fact, house prices hadn't changed for years leading up to them starting to buy. They paid $72,000 for one property, which the people they bought it from had paid $70,000 for 12 years before. So just a $2,000 capital gain in 12 long years. Given Jack had mentioned he was buying property specifically for capital gains, I asked him how he had the confidence that the values would rise, given they had not done so in the last 12 years. Blind faith was probably the best answer to that. He just thought they would go up in value. And no disrespect to Jack, but I think that this idea remains at the centre of many a wannabe landlord today. By the time they divorced when he was 25, they owned one property freehold, but the rest were almost 100% financed. They split the value of their $70,000 assets cleanly down the middle, so both ended up with about $35,000. The value of each house remained the same as when they bought it, so the capital gains were proving a little bit elusive at this point. Jack wanted to keep all 4 houses, and they reached an agreement that he would pay her out an agreed amount over a 2-year period, which he did. So by now he was managing a farm and earning $60,000 a year, and he was able to renegotiate with the bank, max out his capacity to borrow, and take all the debt into his name. Things were on the up, he said. I asked Jack what it was like being a landlord from such a young age. Safe to say there were some highs and some lows. A tenant accidentally burned down one house, but thankfully no one was harmed, and the house was insured. He was going to rebuild, but decided he didn't want the hassle, so he decided to take the $56,000 of insurance money and sell the section, which sold for $35,000. It was not the way he envisaged earning capital gains, but there you have it. He bought the house for about $72,000 and eventually ended up with $91,000, which was a $19,000 gain. However, the numbers are never that cut and dried, and there would have been many expenses to pay along the way, lost rent and what have you. It's very rare for me to speak with someone who owns property who keeps those kinds of records. Back in the late 1990s, he charged his tenants about $135 a week in rent, and his tenants tended to stay put for a while. That was considered average rent for that area, and unlike today, a single parent could move in and still save up a deposit for their own home, he said. In regards to being a landlord, Jack said there were always hassles to deal with, and it was just part of the process really. In around 2001, at the age of 28, Jack was completely burnt out. He had been working extremely hard for a good 10 years, plus buying and managing multiple rental properties as well, not to mention getting married and divorced. So he bought a plane ticket and he left the country with his girlfriend at the time. He based himself in England and spent 2 years working and holidaying. Even though he was heartily sick of farming, it was something he knew and something he was good at. So he worked on a dairy farm and he worked 80-hour weeks. But this time he was paid by the hour, and within 6 short months he had saved up 30,000 New Zealand dollars. He quit his job and he travelled for the next 18 months. It played on his mind that 30 grand could have bought him almost half a house back in Aotearoa, but his incentive this time was the pursuit of fun. So he arrived back home with completely empty pockets, but he considers that 30 grand is the best money he's ever spent. Plus, he still had his rental properties to come back to. While away, he made the decision that he didn't want to just own a few rental properties. He wanted to become a property developer, which is quite the step up. He was sick of some of his tenants and sick of the upkeep, so in about 2004, he said he kicked his tenants out of one house and he spent a whole year pouring his time into the property, completely renovating it before selling it and moving on to the next one. By now, about 11 years since he started buying them, his houses had started to go up in value, and having bought for around $70,000, he now sold for about $150,000. Hindsight was to tell him that if he had just held them for one more year, they would have tripled in value instead of just doubling. But such is life, I guess. Using the equity from the property sale, he bought a house for $300,000 on a 2-acre block on a town boundary that was due to be rezoned residential that was large enough to be subdivided into 2. And he actually ended up keeping this particular property for many years. His long stint at work, plus his 2 years of travel, really kicked off a change in the way Jack works, and ever since that overseas adventure, he's had periods both in and out of paid work. When he wants or needs to work, he does, but if he doesn't want or need to, he simply does not. When he returned to Aotearoa and when he was refurbing his rental properties for sale, he didn't take on a paid job, but instead lived on a revolving credit mortgage. He was disciplined, he said, and used it to cover all his living costs, and given he has a good head for figures, I wondered if he kept any records of the costs he incurred in actually refurbing his properties. Unfortunately, he didn't, meaning that the main numbers I had to work with were buying a house for $70,000 and selling it a decade later for $150,000. This is a capital gain of $80,000, but not really reflective of the profits he made, because he would have had a lot of outgoings and missed out on a lot of rental payments while also accruing interest on the debt with his bank. Between the ages of 30 and 40, he kept buying property and subdividing it, always living in one of the properties. As he explained it all to me, it was actually pretty hard to keep track if I'm honest, but I'm going to do my absolute best to explain it all. He teamed up with a business partner and he went halves in buying a house with them. Over a year, his partner would finance it and Jack would pay them interest, plus he used his house as collateral. And then Jack would do all the planning and build 3 houses in a row on what was formerly a single dwelling site. Houses like this sold like hotcakes, Jack said. And he recalls that in about 2006, 2007, he and his business partner made about $100,000 each after tax, which was considered a good return. He went on to buy a property for himself, sinking that $100,000 profit into another mortgage. He then subdivided the site and built a second house. He also bought another house with another business partner and subdivided that into 5 sections. Much buying and selling was going on, and Jack was enjoying the whole lifestyle because he was lucky, he said, if he had to work as much as a 10-hour week. Basically, his time was spent organising contractors to carry out the work, and his role was to project manage and keep the whole thing moving. The rest of the time was his own. In order to get the money he would need to live, he would buy a house, claim the GST back, and then live off the GST. And when he sold the house and needed to pay that GST back, the house had hopefully made enough profit to allow him to do so, which sounded like a game of roulette to me, but for him, it seemed to mostly work out okay, except for when the global financial crisis, or the GFC, of 2008 happened. When 2008 happened, he was stuck with 5 sections, a house, a brand new house, and a housing market that had stopped dead in its tracks. Not only was nobody buying, but no banks were lending either. He managed to sell the house he'd subdivided off. He moved into one of the others, and he rented out his original house, the one on the 2-acre block that he bought for $300,000. So I hope you're keeping up okay. He owed $700,000 at this stage, which I know does not seem like a lot now, but it was then. And he had no job, and he couldn't develop any of his properties any further because no bank was lending, because no one was buying. It was at this point that Jack thought, oh, wow, this is an interesting challenge to work through. He said that at the time, a bank would give you what he called a low document loan. It would cost you an additional 0.5% in interest, but you didn't have to provide any actual evidence of your income. So when they asked how much you earn, you could pretty much say anything, he said. You could, for example, say that you will earn $140,000 from this project, and they would sign your loan. That was how easy it was, he said. Plus, even though you were plucking a figure out of thin air, you genuinely thought you would make that money. Property investors are an optimistic bunch, even when they don't have the information to prove it. During the GFC, he managed to sell off 2 more houses, and he still made a little but not a lot, because he was under pressure to take the first offer, no matter how cheeky it was. He pressed on and ended up selling everything except the one house that by this point he had held for about 10 years. The one lesson he learned was not to get too far ahead of himself. He got cocky, he said. Until the GFC, he hadn't ever felt the risk nor seen a negative consequence of all his property deals. But he said that once you have felt it firsthand, well, you know what the risks now are. So getting kicked about like this took the gloss off being a property developer for Jack. And when I asked him what his financial flop might be, he said that it was owning too much debt-laden property in a global financial crisis. So after all the frantic mahi, the buying, the slicing up of land, building, refurbing and then selling, he ended up with the house on the 2-acre subdividable property, and he now had a $50,000 mortgage on that property which he bought for $300,000. Plus, all the toing and froing had paid for his life for all those years. Jack went back to full-time paid work in around 2009, back to farming and back to a steady income of about 70 grand a year. But this time, he worked under his terms, working Monday to Friday, 8 till 5, and he threw a lot of his income at his remaining mortgage. When we spoke, he mused that had he kept his original 4 houses, or 3 after one burned to the ground, and gone to live in Thailand, he would have been better off, but c'est la vie, such is life. While being a property developer, he said he enjoyed the lifestyle. He enjoyed not working a normal job, and he felt he had a lot of enjoyable years off. And this is the thing about Jack. Money is important, but it is not really his driving force. It's the thrill of the chase and the lifestyle he can create for himself that is important to him. After a year of working on the farm, he was made redundant when the owner returned and took over his job, and Jack embarked on more travel to countries like Croatia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. The 10 years of what he referred to as slave labour from the age of 17, it really did a number on him, and he found himself much better suited to working to live, not living to work. When he came back, he picked up odd jobs and worked when he needed to, but he spent a lot of unpaid time doing up his 4-bedroom house too. He borrowed against it to give it the full works and pretty much rebuilt the place. He re-roofed, re-plumbed, re-wired, re-walled, put in a new kitchen, replaced the carpets and painted it throughout. But given it was just Jack and his dog, it was just way too big. So in 2016, aged 43, and having owned it for what must have been about 12 years, he sold it for $675,000. When all was said and done and the mortgage was paid off, he came out with $500,000 in the bank, and apart from the stress of the GFC, he seems to have had a relatively enjoyable decade or so. When I was reflecting on my notes as I was writing this up, in many ways he was just self-employed and generating an income by either using cash if he sold a property or using debt if he owned several properties. So the overall outcome was not a high net worth by any stretch, but a paid-for lifestyle each year. As long as he had access to money to pay for his modest lifestyle, life was okay. KiwiSaver began in 2007, and I asked Jack if he was aware of it and if he actually joined. He never did. He always opted out. Why might he do that? Well, simply because he thought he could do better than KiwiSaver, and keeping his entire income meant you could borrow more money, and he needed as much money as he could borrow. Now, I often hear men in particular say this. They think they can do better, but they often don't. I advocate doing both. By all means, grow your own business, but also invest in your KiwiSaver, just in case yours is the one of the myriad of small businesses that fail in New Zealand or barely make you an income along the way. Jack did finally join KiwiSaver sometime well into his 40s, but he only contributes $1,042 a year, which is enough to get the government contributions of $521, but nowhere near enough to provide him a decent income in retirement. His balance today is very low for someone of his age, about 13 grand, and it is with provider simplicity and a high growth fund. And having been a late starter, what advice would he give someone else today? He would have joined earlier. He should have joined earlier. However, he's still not entirely sold on it and doesn't like that he can't use it to retire early, but will need to wait until he turns 65 to access it. But he will keep up his voluntary payments, and if he works for an employer, he will willingly allocate 3% of his wages to his KiwiSaver to get the employer's contribution of 3% too. The next housing purchase he made was in around 2016-2017 when he bought a house at auction for $565,000 on the Kapiti coast of the lower North Island. He bought it so that he could subdivide the back section off it. To pay for it, he put his $500,000 cash into the deal and he got another mortgage to cover the rest. Again, he claimed the GST and he put that money on the mortgage, which brought him back to being mortgage-free again. He picked up paid farm work plus some truck driving work. He also paid out a lot of cash to do the property up and subdivide it so he could sell off the section for $405,000. The buying continued. Mortgage interest rates got as low as 2%, and he purchased another house privately for $850,000 with a long settlement period, which he hoped would give him time to sell his other house, which, thankfully, he did. Although he said he would never buy such a big house again, he did. It was a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom with a 3-car garage. At various times he was in debt, At other times he had money in the bank. But whatever the situation was, well, it never lasted that long. He was always looking for an opportunity to do a housing hustle. He held this for 3 years, selling it for $965,000, making a capital gain of $115,000. Again, I'm not sure of his outgoings on this property. Then he saw another house that he could develop, and he bought it for $1,050,000. As you can see, the value of houses has rocketed in the time since he started purchasing. Because the bank no longer offered a low document home loan, Jack had to go back to full-time work as a stock truck driver so he could show the bank a good income. As a stock truck driver, he developed a unique side hustle where he realised that cattle were cheaper at the bottom of Te Waipunamu than the North Island. He would buy a truckload of cattle, resell them on Trade Me, and transport them to their new North Island owners. After costs, he would earn about $5,000 per load, and one year he said he made $30,000 moving cattle up the country, but other times it was not so profitable. Although all legal and above board, it was a disease outbreak that put a stop to all movement of cattle, and it spelled the end of his side hustle. When he had big borrowings on his rentals, if he wanted to go on holiday, he would often just change banks, and they would give him a $3,000 cash payment for bringing his debt to them. There was always a scheme of some sort going on where he was able to take advantage of a loophole or an offer. He was often without any form of actual income for years at a time, and he either was not in paid work by choice or he had no rentals paying actual rent. Still, he said that he was living off his confidence in himself and I guess the bank's confidence in him by using GST returns and revolving credit mortgages. So while this to me sounds like an intensely convoluted way to make a buck, for Jack, he says it has given him freedom. He sees some of the bigger capital gains he has made when selling a property as his biggest financial triumph. Now, all the buying and the selling, all the borrowing, the paying of taxes according to the Bright Line test, all the lawyer and real estate fees he paid, all the claiming and then paying back a GST, everything he did was declared and legal. But as I was trying to create this podcast, I can tell you that there was just a staggering amount of coming and going. But at all times, he has used an accountant to help him manage it all. He does his GST every 2 months, paying about $80 for accounting help. Plus, he pays for one-off phone calls and accounting advice at a cost of about $500 a year. He said a common question from his accountant is, well, what scheme are you up to this time, Jack? Now, I may have missed a house purchase and sale or two, but I think you get the idea here. He traded in and out of a lot of property over the years as a way to make money. He chopped up land, he fixed up houses, and he built new ones too. So where is Jack at today with his main choice of investment, property? He decided he wanted to live in a smaller house and be closer to the sea, and during COVID times he bought a property with 2 dwellings on it for $1,050,000. He moved into one and then he rented out the other. Initially, he put a lot of cash into the deal, had a mortgage of about $335,000, and he kept about $500,000 of cash in the bank. He reasoned that interest rates were low and that he could earn a higher interest rate with a savings account at the bank. A lot of people thought this way, saying, well, why would you pay off cheap debt? Well, the reason is because interest rates might go down to historical lows, but they can easily go back up, and you are paying a lot more interest for your debt. If you pay off the low interest debt, you pay off more principal. So when mortgage interest went from 2% to 7%, he used the cash he had in the bank to pay off his $335,000 mortgage straight away. It left him with a house he owned outright and $175,000 in the bank. So pretty much 30 years since he began buying rentals and 20 years since he embarked on being a property developer, he has a net worth of $1.225 million. Fortunately, Jack seems to have mostly enjoyed himself along the way, but it seems like a ton of mahi to effectively end up house rich but cash poor. But the journey continues, and his local council has changed their zoning rules, and he's since subdivided this plot into 2 properties. At the time we spoke, he is working on dividing it into 3. What has it cost him lately to carry out this type of subdivision work, I wondered? It cost him $60,000 to do the first subdivision, and there will be yet more costs for the second. When Jack and I had our long and enjoyable korero, he was actually house sitting over in America, relaxing in a very nice home in San Francisco, where he was living for free while pet sitting for the owners. He'd already been away for many months. He left New Zealand in May and was either house sitting or paying for accommodation as he toured about. He'd planned to be away for about 6 months in total. So the subdivision of the property is working its way through the system while he is away. So how exactly is he surviving financially, you might ask, given that he seems to have low cash reserves and some significant outgoings? Given that he currently owns his property without debt and has some cash in the bank, he is in the very rare position of being a rental property owner who actually gets to keep their rent, after expenses of course. His current property has 2 houses on it. One is his small and quite gorgeous 45 square metre home, I've googled it, which while he is away he rents out for $420 a week, and the other was a 70 square metre dwelling that he was already renting out for $500 a week, meaning that he is currently receiving a rental income of $920 a week. His guess at outgoings such as rates and insurance and taxes and what have you is about $200 a week. He decided to take all of 2024 off, and apart from organising some things to do with the subdivision, he would not do any paid work. He has recently read Die with Zero by Bill Perkins, and he realised at the age of 49 that once your health is gone, you've got nothing. So that really kicked him into his year of action in 2024. He had some money in the bank and he realised he probably couldn't spend it all, even if he tried. He immediately booked and took a cruise, something that had been on his bucket list. And he wanted to ride the Otago Central Rail Trail and walk on the Aotearoa Trail as well. He wanted to catch up with old friends overseas and just get out and see the world. So he took $30,000 from his savings and he thought, I'll see how it goes. So this is just $576 a week. He's been keeping a record of his spending and he is currently spending $1,300 a week. So he is using $724 of his rental income to make up the difference. When he gets home, if it's all been approved by his council, he will have a new small front section to sell off his property, and he thinks it will sell above $280,000. I'm not sure how much of that is profit, considering his subdivision costs. He said at that point he could get a job if he wants, or he could just live off this money plus rent for many years. Die with Zero has been a game changer for him and made him think more than ever he will use his money to enjoy his time. A second influential book that he has yet to action is The Simple Path to Wealth by J.L. Collins, he said. So essentially, to summarise, and I know this has been quite complex, he has almost divided his site into 3. There are 2 small homes and 1 section. He estimates that if he liquidated it all, he would end up with about $1.4 million. He is naturally frugal, so there are not too many outgoings from what I could deduce. But he has been with health insurer Southern Cross since the age of 18, and he currently pays about $140 each month. He has house insurance and third-party insurance on his trusty old Toyota that has about 170,000 Ks on the clock and is only worth about $3,500. I asked Jack what he would be telling me he was up to if I were to catch up with him in a year's time. It would be that property is ingrained in him, but he doesn't really want to be in the rental market anymore. He's getting a bit sick of it all. Banks have not lent to him for a while now. They wouldn't even give him a credit card when he recently tried to get one. And if he wanted to borrow more money, he would have to go back working. And he doesn't want to work. Banking relationships are interesting. People who say to me, my bank is great, generally all have debt. Your bank will run around after you because they want the interest you're paying. People who say, my bank wouldn't even allow me to get a credit card, don't have debt. Banks love you when you are borrowing. They don't need you when you are saving, even if you have had a long banking relationship with them. Probably one of the biggest benefits of being debt-free is that I actually never have to ask the opinion of my bank about anything I choose to do financially, and it's quite liberating. Jack is beginning to think that if he sold $1 million in property and invested that cash in a VTSAX type index fund that J.L. Collins details in his book, well, he could draw a passive income after tax of $40,000 a year, which is more than what he currently receives from his complex property arrangements, and it's far easier to access. When he returns home at the end of 2024, he intends to start really looking at moving money into a more passive type of investment. For the very first time, Jack has created a will, and he said he realises that everything he has is really complicated. Having spent days turning our kōrero into a script that actually makes some form of sense, I concur. Reading Die with Zero has really made him think. He has downsized as much as he can to a comfortable 45 square metre property, so he has a house that is the right size for him, and he could keep that, sell the rest, and invest his money in an index or ETF fund instead, he thinks. That book has got him thinking, so I am very interested to keep in touch and see what his situation looks like 1 year from now. Jack would have turned 51 this year, and he is effectively retired, for now, and I wondered how he is going with that. While there is the occasional day where he struggles to keep busy, given he is travelling full-time, currently life is really full. He said that when he meets people and they ask the standard question of, "What do you do?" it is hard to explain what he actually does. If he says retired, people say he is too young, and they wonder if he has enough to do. So, for now, he is saying he is a self-employed property investor. 2024 has been a whole year of getting out and about, really. The first half of the year was spent getting his 2 rentals up and running, then he spent time down south hiking and cycling, and he was cycling the Otago Central Rail Trail when he stopped in to see me. Plus, as an animal lover and hands-down handy guy to have about your whare, he spent time pet and house sitting so that he could get some experience and some testimonials for when he travelled overseas. Somewhere along the way, he also fitted in a couple of short polytechnic courses in animal welfare and business. So, safe to say, Jack is a busy guy. While overseas in 2024, he has travelled through many countries and either stayed with friends, done pet sitting and house sitting gigs for weeks at a time in some fabulous locations, or paid for accommodation. He's not done his sums in detail, but he does feel that 1,300 New Zealand dollars a week is almost enough, especially when he has enjoyed so much free accommodation. For Jack, managing his money is very fluid. He does not budget, and he said he just has a gut feeling most of the time. This going with the flow mentality applied to all aspects of his pūtea. He has been mulling over how to structure his money in the coming years, and when I asked him what he would do with $10,000 if it turned up in his bank account this afternoon, he said that he would use it to buy index funds for the very first time. The thought of becoming a share investor by investing in an ETF or an index fund is unsettling for Jack, so he's been trying to learn more about it. But having been property his whole life, it is hardly surprising that no one else he knows invests in the share market. They are all into property. To try to address this imbalance, I've actually connected him with people I know who have switched from property to share market investing and not only survived but thrived. It will be good for him to hear some real-life examples. He listened to Alan and Katie Donegan from Rebel Finance School speak recently, and they only invest in a FTSE Global All-Cap Index Fund, plus they are retired early, and they say that a lot of people have all the money they will ever need, but they don't retire early enough to actually enjoy it. Resources like this, plus again author J.L. Collins, are what he needs to school himself up to convince himself that investing this way is safe and profitable. Jack needs cash each year, and selling a chunk of house off each year is just not possible, but it is with ETF or index fund investing. He's not quite convinced yet, but I'm pleased he is researching his options. Now, 2 years ago, he said he spent a lot of time and money on self-improvement and talking with qualified health professionals. This actually led to an ADHD diagnosis, which he said kind of explained why he was often unsettled, got bored pretty quick, was always seeking something new, moved about a lot, and relationships often didn't last. And he just couldn't stay in the same place for too long. His trading in and out of property, often at great financial risk and at such a fast and convoluted pace. One time he actually bought a property unconditionally without even having the lending in place. Well, it made more sense to him once he saw it through an ADHD lens. Now that he has learned a lot more about himself, he said that life is good and more settled. And he has concluded that life would be boring without ADHD because it also makes him the creative and interesting person that he is. Just that now he can concentrate on one thing at a time and still get tons of stuff done. Being all over the place is just who Jack is, so that won't change, but he said he's more measured now. given he is moving about the world at the moment, I wondered how he is entertaining himself. I know a lot of people who are retired and travel full-time, and you can't spend every day visiting cathedrals. So what else does he get up to? He loves hiking or tramping and cycling. He has taken up writing and journaling, where he writes about all the really interesting people he meets along the way. He's a bloke who likes to have a yarn, so his chances of meeting interesting strangers on the daily is very high. He listens to true crime podcasts, reads money-related blogs such as mine, The Happy Saver, Mr. Money Mustache, and also Rebel Donegan's. And finally, I like asking the question, if you could retain all of the knowledge that you have today regarding money, and you could go back to your 15-year-old self and start again, what would you do, whether it be the same or something quite different? Jack said he would not have worked so hard dairy farming. He would have and should have changed career. Working so hard in his late teens and early to mid-20s had scared him in a way and made him allergic to working too hard. He would not have got married so young, but he would have still done property because he has actually always enjoyed the challenge. But if he is being totally honest with himself, it is more a hobby than a money-making enterprise. He also would have joined KiwiSaver earlier, and as for the travel, he's done plenty of it and would do it all again, although some days all the getting from A to B and getting sorted does feel like hard work. So there you have it, the life and times of a property investor turned global traveller. So, as I'm nearing the end, but before I wrap up, I have another quick message from today's sponsor. If your finances are holding you back from living the life you want, try Pocketsmith out. They've got the tools to help you make money management easier. And have we got a deal for you? Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of Pocketsmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. That's pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. Now, I can't quite recall when I first heard from or spoke with Jack, but I quickly concluded he's an easy person to know. He is very interesting and very open to just trying something that takes his interest, and he is very curious about what other people are up to as well. He does stuff that many of us want to do, but put off doing for another time, such as quitting a job for a year or two to pursue other things that interest him. He figures he can always go back to work again, but he might not get to do the interesting things again, and that really resonated with me. I think that if you bumped into him in a dock hut on the Aotearoa trail one afternoon, you could easily talk the evening away and still be thinking about the conversations you had the next day. I like that he figured out that there is more to life than just work. Working so hard in his youth both scared and scarred him, and it certainly made him take a less well-worn path through life. He was correct when he said that health and time are the two things that money can't buy. The way he's gone about property would not be my cup of tea at all. Too many levers being pulled with not enough to show for it, but this is Jack's life, not mine, and he seems pretty darn happy as it's given him many homes to live in and the opportunity to travel. So when I finally asked Jack what the most extravagant thing was that he'd purchased for himself recently, it was travel and choosing his mode of transport home from America to Aotearoa. As I wrote this episode up, Jack was out of contact as he made his way home to New Zealand on a cruise ship. It was going to take him just over 3 weeks to get back, and that's how you can avoid several long flights home crammed into an economy seat. He worked out that it would cost him about $110 a day for all his food, entertainment, and of course transportation. When you have time, as he does, you can spend a few weeks getting back home, and I have zero doubt that he would have connected with a bunch of really interesting people on the ship along the way. So that's it for this week's episode, and I just wanted to say a big thank you to Jack for speaking at length with me, and I sincerely hope that I've got all the ins and outs of his property dealings more or less right. We will definitely be staying in touch with Jack, as Jonny and I really enjoy having friends around the motu who work less and live more. Now, if you want to get in touch, you know you can find me over at my blog, thehappysaver.com, where I share a lot of information about how I manage money in my life, including the fact that, like Jack, I've recently quit my job. Plus, if you sign up for my fortnightly email, I'm always linking to other useful personal finance blogs, podcasts, books, and money-related content. So, thanks for listening to this. I hope you took a few nuggets of wisdom from this episode that you can now go and apply to your own life. And please do share the Happy Saver with your friends. It really is the best way that people can learn about the podcast, and I would of course love it if you would talk more about money with your own friends and whānau and help me continue to help others be better with money. So until next time, happy saving.